There was a time when New York's streets carried names that no longer echo today. Lanes erased, alleys swallowed, and thoroughfares forgotten. To walk through Lower Manhattan in the early 19th century was to step into a maze of narrow paths, many of which have since disappeared beneath the city's relentless march toward modernity. These vanished streets tell us more than geography. They reveal the struggles, controversies, and choices that shaped the city's identity. New York's earliest streets were not planned with precision. They grew from Dutch colonial paths, Native American trails, and improvised routes between farms and docks. By the late 1700s, the city was expanding rapidly. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 imposed a rigid grid system on Manhattan, a decision that erased many irregular streets. This plan was controversial. It promised order and efficiency, but it also destroyed older pathways that carried centuries of memory. Streets such as Crown Street, George Street, and others vanished as the grid advanced northward. Each disappearance reflected a clash between history and progress. Governor Morris, Simeon DeWitt, and John Rutherford were the three commissioners who designed the 1811 plan. Their vision was bold, a city of straight avenues and cross streets stretching across Manhattan. They believed irregular streets were inefficient and hindered commerce. Local landowners resisted. Families who had lived along winding colonial lanes saw their homes cut through or demolished. The commissioners were accused of ignoring heritage in favor of profit. Yet they pressed forward, convinced that the city's destiny required sacrifice. One of the most striking examples was Crown Street, a short but historically significant lane that once ran near today's City Hall in Lower Manhattan. Crown Street dated back to the colonial period, appearing on 18th-century maps as part of the irregular street network that surrounded the Old Commons, later City Hall Park. It was named during the British colonial era, reflecting loyalty to the Crown before the Revolution. After independence, its name carried uncomfortable associations, and by the early 19th century, planners saw it as expendable. When the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 imposed the rigid grid system on Manhattan, Crown Street was among the casualties. By the 1820s, it had been absorbed into the expanding civic center, its memory preserved only in old maps and property records. Another example was George Street, which had existed near the Bowery. George Street was part of the early street network laid out during the Dutch and British colonial period, serving as a connector between small residential lanes and commercial hubs. It was narrow, irregular, and poorly aligned with the new grid. As the Bowery developed into a major thoroughfare in the early 19th century, George Street was gradually erased. By mid-century, it no longer appeared on official maps, its space consumed by redevelopment and alignment projects that sought to impose order on the chaotic downtown. The disappearance of these streets had consequences beyond geography. Families lost landmarks tied to their ancestry, merchants lost familiar routes to docks and markets. The city gained efficiency, but it lost texture. The controversy was not only about streets, it was about memory. New York was becoming a city that valued growth over preservation. This tension would repeat itself throughout the 19th century as more streets vanished under waves of redevelopment. Little Queen Street was a narrow lane that once ran near present-day Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan. It appeared on late 18th century maps and was known for its cluster of small shops and tradespeople. The street reflected the colonial character of New York, where irregular lanes wound through markets and residential areas. By the early 1800s, however, Little Queen Street was erased as the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 imposed the grid system. Its disappearance was tied to the city's effort to standardize downtown streets, and by the 1820s, it no longer appeared on official maps. Merchants who had operated there were forced to relocate, and the street's memory survived only in property records and rare references in newspapers. Chapel Street, located near Trinity Church, carried both religious and civic significance. It was named for Trinity's chapel and served as a connector between Broadway and smaller lanes. As Broadway expanded in the early 19th century, Chapel Street was removed. Trinity Church itself influenced the decision, seeking more space for its grounds and aligning with city planners who wanted to widen Broadway. The erasure reflected the power of institutions in shaping the city's geography. Chapel Street's disappearance was not only a matter of urban planning, it was also a reminder of how religious and civic authorities could reshape neighborhoods to suit their needs. Not all streets vanished entirely. Some were renamed rather than erased, preserving their utility while erasing their original identity. Dock Street, for example, was absorbed into Water Street. Dock Street had been a vital thoroughfare near the East River, serving merchants and sailors. As the waterfront was redeveloped, the name was dropped and Water Street expanded to cover its path. Renaming was a compromise. The street continued to exist physically, but its history was obscured. Residents who had known Dock Street by name saw it vanish from maps, replaced by a more utilitarian designation. By the mid-19th century, the pace of change accelerated. Immigrant communities, especially Irish and German families, settled in areas where old streets had been erased. They often lived in hastily built tenements along new grid lines. The loss of older streets meant the loss of community anchors. For example, Oliver Street, once a small lane near the East River, was absorbed into larger developments. Residents complained that the city was erasing their neighborhoods to favor wealthy landowners. The controversy deepened. Was New York a city for its people or for its planners? By the middle of the 19th century, New York was no longer just a port city, it was becoming the industrial heart of America. But with factories rising and warehouses spreading, entire streets were erased, swallowed by commerce. The story of these vanished paths is not only about bricks and mortar, it is about the working-class families who lived there, the controversies that erupted, and the choices that defined the city's future. Between the 1830s and 1860s, New York's waterfronts became crowded with shipyards, warehouses, and factories. The East River and Hudson River edges were transformed into industrial corridors. Streets that once carried small homes and taverns were demolished to make way for docks and storage facilities. The city's leaders argued that industry was essential for prosperity, yet for thousands of residents, it meant losing their homes and their streets. The industrial boom was driven by shipping, textiles, and printing. The rise of the garment industry in particular reshaped Lower Manhattan. Streets such as Bayard Street's extensions and Oliver Street's lanes were cut short or absorbed into larger developments. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping magnate, was one of the most powerful figures in 19th century New York. By the 1830s and 1840s, his steamboat empire dominated the East River and Hudson River. To expand his operations, Vanderbilt invested heavily in docks and warehouses along the waterfront. His influence pushed city leaders to prioritize shipping infrastructure over residential streets. Small lanes near the river, once home to immigrant families and small shops, were demolished to make way for larger piers and storage facilities. For Vanderbilt, this was progress. His empire grew, and New York became a hub of commerce. For residents, it meant displacement and the loss of familiar streets. Peter Cooper, the industrialist and philanthropist, also reshaped the city's geography. In the 1820s, Cooper built ironworks near the East River, producing rails, machinery, and other industrial goods. His factory complex required space, and smaller lanes were absorbed into the growing industrial district. Streets that had once carried modest homes and workshops disappeared beneath Cooper's projects. Yet Cooper's legacy was complicated. While his ironworks erased streets, they also created jobs for hundreds of workers, many of them immigrants. Later, Cooper founded the Cooper Union, a school that offered free education, showing that his vision for progress included philanthropy as well as industry. City officials often aligned themselves with wealthy industrialists. They approved demolitions with little regard for the families displaced. In council meetings and planning boards, the voices of merchants and landowners carried more weight than those of working-class residents. Streets such as Cherry Street and Oliver Street were gradually erased or shortened as warehouses and factories expanded. Families who had lived there for generations were forced to move into crowded tenements farther uptown. Officials justified these decisions by pointing to the city's need for growth, but critics argued that they were sacrificing communities for profit. Cherry Street, once a thriving residential area near the East River, was gradually consumed by warehouses. By the 1850s, much of its original character was gone. Oliver Street, a small lane near the waterfront, was shortened and absorbed into industrial complexes. Banker Street, later renamed Madison Street, saw parts erased as tenements and factories expanded. James Slip was once a small but lively street near the East River in Lower Manhattan. It appeared on early maps as part of the dense waterfront network of slips, narrow lanes leading to docks where ships unloaded cargo. James Slip was a hub for sailors, merchants, and dock workers. Taverns and boarding houses lined the street, serving men who worked on the river. Rutgers Slip was another waterfront street, named after the prominent Rutgers family who owned large tracts of land in the area during the colonial period. Rutgers Slip connected the East River docks to inland markets, and for decades it was a busy thoroughfare for sailors and merchants. As industry expanded along the waterfront in the 19th century, Rutgers Slip was shortened and transformed into industrial space. Warehouses and factories replaced homes and shops, and the street lost its original character. Though the name Rutgers Slip persisted in some references, the street itself was no longer recognizable. By the 1850s, the tension reached its peak. The city's industrial leaders argued that erasing streets was necessary for growth. Workers argued that it destroyed their communities. The debate was not abstract, it was lived daily. Families displaced from Cherry Street or Oliver Street had to crowd into tenements along the Bowery. Disease, poverty, and crime followed. The controversy was sharpened by the city's politics. Tammany Hall, the political machine, often sided with industrialists. Workers felt betrayed. The erasure of streets became a symbol of corruption and neglect. Between 1840 and 1890, waves of Irish, German, Italian, and Jewish immigrants transformed Lower Manhattan. Malberry Bend was one of the most infamous yet vibrant corners of New York in the late 19th century. Located in the Five Points district, it was home to thousands of Italian and Irish immigrants who lived in crowded tenements. The Bend was notorious for its poverty, crime, and disease, but it was also a place of resilience where families built lives despite hardship. Jacob Riis documented the conditions in his groundbreaking 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. His photographs of Mulberry Bend shocked the public, showing dark alleys, overcrowded rooms, and children playing in filth. Riis and other reformers argued that the Bend was a breeding ground for disease and crime, and they pushed for its demolition. By the 1890s, the city acted. Mulberry Bend was cleared, and in its place rose Columbus Park, opened in 1997. Reformers celebrated the park as a triumph of sanitation and order, a symbol of progress. They believed fresh air and open space would improve the lives of immigrants. Yet, for the families who had lived there, the demolition was a loss. Mulberry Bend had been their community, with shops, churches, and social networks. Its erasure scattered them into other neighborhoods, breaking apart the bonds they had formed. The park was clean, but the culture of the Bend was gone. Orange Street and Cross Street were also part of the Five Points neighborhood, a place infamous worldwide for its crime and poverty. These streets carried stories of resilience and survival. They were home to saloons, boarding houses, and immigrant families who struggled to make ends meet. Writers such as Charles Dickens, who visited Five Points in 1842, described the area as chaotic but full of life. By the late 19th century, however, reformers and city officials saw Orange and Cross Streets as symbols of shame. They believed the only solution was demolition. As redevelopment spread, these streets were erased. Their disappearance symbolized the city's determination to wipe away its troubled past, replacing it with wider avenues and new housing. Anthony Street, another lane in Five Points, met the same fate. It had been a narrow, irregular street lined with tenements and small shops. Like Mulberry Bend, it was crowded and unsanitary, but it was also a place of community. Families lived side by side, sharing resources and traditions. When Anthony Street was demolished, its residents were displaced, forced to move into other crowded neighborhoods. The city gained order, but the families lost their home. The consequences were profound. Families who had lived on Mulberry Bend for generations were displaced. Italian immigrants lost their central gathering place. Irish families lost their markets. Jewish immigrants lost synagogues tucked into narrow lanes. The city gained parks and wider streets, but it lost the intimacy of immigrant life. Reformers argued that erasure was necessary for health and safety. Immigrants argued that it destroyed their culture. Newspapers recorded debates about whether the city was saving lives or erasing heritage. Bandit's Roost, a narrow alley off Mulberry Bend, was photographed by Jacob Riis. It became famous as a symbol of poverty. Yet few remember that it was also a place of community, where families supported each other. Paradise Park, a small square in Five Points, was demolished along with surrounding streets. Its name carried irony, as it was known for crime, but it was also a playground for children. Some erased streets were remembered in literature. Writers such as Charles Dickens and Stephen Crane described Five Points, preserving its memory even after its streets were gone. These details remind us that erasure was not only physical, it was cultural. By the 1890s, the tension reached its peak. Reformers celebrated the demolition of Mulberry Bend as a triumph. Immigrants saw it as a loss. The debate was not abstract, it was lived daily. Families displaced from Orange Street or Cross Street had to crowd into new tenements farther uptown. Their culture was scattered. Between 1900 and 1930, New York launched massive projects to connect boroughs and modernize its core. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, opened 1883, had already reshaped parts of Lower Manhattan, but the early 20th century brought more. The Manhattan Bridge, 1909, the Williamsburg Bridge, 1903, and the Holland Tunnel, 1927. Each project required demolitions. Streets that had existed for generations were cut, shortened, or erased. Skyscrapers also rose during this era. The Woolworth Building, 1913, and other towers demanded space, forcing the removal of smaller streets. The controversy was clear. Progress demanded sacrifice, and the streets bore the cost. John Roebling and Washington Roebling, engineers of the Brooklyn Bridge, set the precedent for demolitions. Their project erased streets near the East River. Othmar Ammann, the engineer behind the George Washington Bridge, opened 1931, influenced the reshaping of Manhattan's northern streets. From the 1940s through the 1960s, New York embraced urban renewal as a solution to overcrowding and poverty. Federal funds supported massive redevelopment projects. The city targeted slums, often immigrant and working-class neighborhoods, for demolition. Streets vanished beneath highways, parks, and housing towers. The most famous figure of this era was Robert Moses, the city planner whose vision reshaped New York. His projects promised modernity, but they erased countless streets. Jane Jacobs, the writer and activist, became one of the most important voices in the fight against large-scale urban renewal in New York. In 1961, she published The Death and Life of Great American Cities, a book that challenged the prevailing ideas of city planning. At the time, planners such as Robert Moses believed that wide highways, superblocks, and the demolition of older streets were the path to progress. Jacobs argued the opposite. She insisted that erasing streets destroyed the very fabric of communities. Jacobs lived in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood threatened by Moses's plans for expressways and redevelopment. She observed daily life on its streets, children playing, neighbors talking, small shops thriving, and she believed these interactions were the foundation of urban vitality. In her book, she wrote that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because, and only when, they are created by everybody. Her words became a rallying cry for residents who feared losing their streets to highways and towers. Her activism was not abstract. In the early 1960s, Moses proposed the Lower Manhattan Expressway, a highway that would have cut through Soho and Little Italy, erasing entire streets and displacing thousands of families. Jacobs organized community meetings, led protests, and spoke directly to city officials. She argued that the destruction of streets would destroy neighborhoods, scattering communities and erasing culture. Her resistance helped stop the project, preserving the character of Lower Manhattan. Jacobs's influence extended beyond New York. Her ideas reshaped urban planning across the United States and abroad. She showed that streets were not just traffic routes, they were social spaces, essential to community life. Her insistence on preserving them challenged the dominance of planners like Moses, who saw streets as obstacles to modernity. City officials, often aligned with Moses, approved demolitions despite protests. These figures embodied the era's clash, Moses's vision of modernity versus Jacobs's defense of community. Willow Street in Brooklyn Heights was once a quiet residential street lined with 19th-century row houses and small businesses. It carried the character of one of New York's oldest neighborhoods, where families lived close to the East River and enjoyed views of Manhattan. In the 1940s, however, Robert Moses pushed forward the construction of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, BQE. The highway cut directly through Brooklyn Heights, erasing Willow Street and several adjoining blocks. Homes were demolished, families displaced, and a neighborhood forever altered. While the BQE improved traffic flow between boroughs, it destroyed part of Brooklyn's historic fabric. Residents mourned the loss, and preservationists later fought to save what remained of Brooklyn Heights, leading to its designation as one of the city's first historic districts in 1965. Late Street in Lower Manhattan carried history back to the early 19th century. It ran through what became known as Hudson Square, a district of warehouses and printing shops. By the 1920s, the construction of the Holland Tunnel, which opened in 1927, required massive demolitions. Late Street was shortened and partly erased to make way for tunnel approaches and ventilation structures. Later redevelopment further reduced its presence, leaving only fragments of the original street. For residents and merchants, the loss of Late Street meant the destruction of familiar routes and the scattering of businesses. The tunnel was hailed as an engineering marvel, but its footprint erased pieces of the city's past. On Manhattan's west side, the Washington Market District was once a bustling hub of produce and wholesale goods. Narrow streets such as College Place and parts of Greenwich Street carried wagons, carts, and workers who supplied food to the city. In the 1960s, however, the decision to build the World Trade Center erased much of this district. Entire blocks of streets vanished beneath the massive footprint of the Twin Towers. Merchants of Radio Row, centered on Cortlandt Street, were displaced, and the Washington Market's smaller lanes disappeared. The city gained a global financial symbol, but it lost a neighborhood that had sustained generations of workers and small businesses. In the Bronx, the construction of the Cross-Bronx Expressway in the 1950s and 1960s destroyed entire sections of neighborhoods. Streets such as parts of East Tremont Avenue were cut through, leaving communities divided by concrete. Thousands of families were displaced, many of them working-class immigrants. The expressway was controversial from the start. Robert Moses insisted it was necessary to connect boroughs and modernize the city, but residents argued it destroyed their lives. The erasure of Bronx streets became a symbol of urban renewal's human cost. The scars of the Cross-Bronx Expressway remain visible today, with neighborhoods still struggling from the disruption it caused. The consequences were harsh. Tens of thousands of families were displaced. Immigrant and working-class communities lost their homes. Streets that had carried daily life vanished. Resistance grew. Jane Jacobs led protests against Moses's plans to build highways through Greenwich Village. Residents argued that erasing streets destroyed the soul of the city. As the 20th century moved into its later decades, New York was no longer just a city of bridges and highways. It was becoming the financial capital of the world. Towers of glass and steel rose in Lower Manhattan. Cultural institutions expanded, and redevelopment projects swept through neighborhoods. Yet beneath this march of progress, streets disappeared. They were erased not by disease or poverty this time, but by the weight of finance, culture, and ambition. From the 1960s through the 1980s, New York embraced redevelopment as a way to modernize its image. The financial district expanded, cultural centers grew, and housing projects continued. Streets that had carried families and small businesses were demolished to make way for skyscrapers, plazas, and institutions. The most dramatic example was the construction of the World Trade Center, begun in 1966. Its massive footprint erased entire blocks of Lower Manhattan. Streets such as Radio Row's Cortlandt Street, along with parts of Greenwich Street and Washington Market's smaller lanes, vanished beneath the towers. Governor Nelson Rockefeller and Mayor John Lindsay supported the World Trade Center project, despite protests from local merchants. Port Authority of New York and New Jersey oversaw demolitions and construction. Cortlandt Street was once the beating heart of Radio Row, a bustling district in Lower Manhattan that thrived from the 1920s through the early 1960s. Radio Row was famous for its hundreds of small electronics shops where merchants sold radios, parts, and later televisions. It was a hub of innovation and entrepreneurship, drawing customers from across the city. Cortlandt Street carried the energy of this community, lined with storefronts and crowded with workers and shoppers. In the mid-1960s, however, the decision to build the World Trade Center erased Cortlandt Street entirely. The Port Authority condemned the area, displacing hundreds of small businesses and thousands of workers. Merchants protested, arguing that the city was destroying a unique cultural and economic hub. Despite their resistance, demolition went forward. Cortlandt Street vanished beneath the massive footprint of the Twin Towers, its memory preserved only in oral histories and photographs. Greenwich Street's southern sections were also reshaped by the World Trade Center project. Greenwich Street had once run continuously through Lower Manhattan, connecting neighborhoods and markets. With the construction of the Trade Center, its southern portions were shortened and absorbed into the site. The street lost its continuity, and the familiar routes that had carried wagons, trucks, and pedestrians for generations were broken. For residents and merchants, the change was more than physical. It disrupted the daily rhythms of life. Greenwich Street's erasure symbolized the city's prioritization of monumental development over neighborhood continuity. The Washington Market District, once a thriving wholesale produce market, was also erased during redevelopment. Narrow lanes such as College Place carried carts and wagons filled with fruits, vegetables, and goods that supplied the city. The market had been a vital part of New York's economy since the early 19th century. By the mid-20th century, however, officials saw it as outdated. Redevelopment plans targeted the district, and the construction of the World Trade Center erased its smaller streets. Merchants were displaced, and the market's bustling energy disappeared. The erasure of Washington Market's lanes reflected the city's shift from local commerce to global finance. On the west side, near Lincoln Square, redevelopment had already erased much of the San Juan Hill neighborhood in the 1950s to make way for Lincoln Center. Streets such as West 62nd and West 63rd were demolished, displacing thousands of African American and Puerto Rican families. In the following decades, as cultural institutions expanded, more West Side streets were erased or altered. The area was reshaped into a cultural district, but at the cost of community. Families who had lived there for generations lost their homes, and the streets that carried their culture vanished. The consequences were harsh. Radio Row merchants lost their shops. Families lost homes. Communities were scattered. The city gained towers and plazas, but it lost intimacy. Merchants protested against the demolition of Cortlandt Street. They argued that the city was erasing small businesses to favor finance. Officials insisted that redevelopment was necessary for progress. The debate revealed the tension between community and ambition. Radio Row, centered on Cortlandt Street, was home to hundreds of electronics shops. Its erasure destroyed a unique cultural hub. College Place, a small street near Washington Market, vanished during redevelopment. Few remember it today, but it had carried markets for decades. Some erased streets were remembered in oral histories, but the physical paths were gone.